Some places you visit leave you with fond memories. Others haunt you forever. Ashton Hollow is one of those places I wish I'd never gone. What happened there wasn't just strange. It was something I can't explain, something that still wakes me up at night. It all started when an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in years, invited me to visit their small town. If I'd known what was waiting for me there, I never would have gone. I hadn't thought about Bryce in years. We'd been close in high school, but life pulled us in different directions after graduation. Bryce was always the life of the party, the guy who could charm his way into any crowd. I was quieter, more content to stay on the sidelines. Somehow, our differences balanced each other out, and we became best friends. We lost touch after graduation. I went off to college a few states away, and Bryce stayed in our hometown, working odd jobs and figuring things out. Social media kept us loosely connected, but we rarely talked. That's why his message last month caught me off guard. "Drew, long time, man. You should come visit. I've got a place in Ashton Hollow now, small town vibes, but you'd love it. Seriously, let's catch up." At first, I wasn't sure if I should go. I just started a new job as a regional project manager for a logistics company, and most of my time was spent traveling between cities. But Bryce was persistent. Over the next few days, he sent me pictures of his house, the local scenery, even a plate of homemade barbecue ribs he swore were worth the drive. I finally gave in. My next assignment was only an hour's drive from Ashton Hollow, so I figured I'd stop by for the weekend. What's the harm, right? The drive to Ashton Hollow was uneventful at first. I left the city mid-morning, the highway lined with endless stretches of trees and the occasional gas station. But as I turned onto the road leading to the town, the landscape began to change. The trees grew denser, their shadows stretching across the pavement like dark fingers. The air seemed cooler, heavier, as if the forest itself was pressing in. My GPS struggled to find the exact location of Bryce's house, rerouting me several times before finally settling on a narrow gravel road. I followed it, the sound of my tires crunching against the rocks the only noise in the oppressive silence. When I finally pulled up to Bryce's house, I was relieved to see his familiar face waiting on the porch. He looked almost the same as I remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, with that easy grin that made you feel like everything was going to be okay. "Drew," he called out, his arms wide open. "Man, it's been forever. Welcome to Ashton Hollow." The house was charming in a rustic way, a two-story cabin surrounded by tall pines. The front yard was dotted with wild flowers and a faint smell of wood. Smoke lingered in the air. Bryce led me inside, giving me a quick tour. His place was cozy, with mismatched furniture, a crackling fireplace, and walls covered in old photos and knickknacks. We spent the evening catching up. Bryce cooked dinner, a surprisingly good steak, and we sat on the back porch drinking beers and reminiscing about our high school days. He told me about Ashton Hollow, how he'd moved there a few years ago to get away from the city. "It's quiet out here," he said, leaning back in his chair. "No traffic, no noise, just peace." I nodded, though something about the town felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was an underlying tension, like the calm before a storm. As the night wore on, Bryce grew more serious. He started talking about the town's history, how it had been founded by settlers in the late 1800s. "They say Ashton Hollow's always been a little different," he said, his voice low. "Some folks around here think the place has a way of getting under your skin." I laughed nervously. "What does that even mean?" Bryce shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe it's just small-town gossip. But sometimes it feels like there's something watching you, like the woods have eyes." I brushed it off as Bryce's attempt to spook me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't entirely joking. By the time I went to bed, I was exhausted. Bryce had set me up in the guest room, a cozy little space with a quilt-covered bed and a window overlooking the backyard. As I drifted off to sleep, the sound of crickets outside lulled me into a sense of calm. That calm didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up to a low, droning sound. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized it was more like a hum, deep and resonant, almost mechanical. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound seemed to be coming from outside. I pulled the curtain aside and froze. In the moonlight, I could see figures standing in the distance, just beyond the edge of the yard. They were motionless, their silhouettes barely distinguishable from the shadows of the trees. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the longer I stared, the more unsettling it became. Suddenly, the humming stopped. The figures turned in unison and vanished into the darkness. I stayed by the window for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Who were they? What were they doing? I wanted to wake Bryce to ask him what the hell was going on, but something held. Be back? The town might have been peaceful during the day, but now it felt like something out of a nightmare. I woke up the next morning feeling groggy, as if I hadn't slept at all. The guest room, which had seemed so inviting the night before, now felt cold and unfamiliar. Rays of sunlight filtered through the window, but they did little to dispel the unease lingering from what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen in the yard. I debated whether to tell Bryce about the strange figures, but something held me back. Maybe it was embarrassment. I didn't want to sound paranoid. Or maybe it was the creeping fear that Bryce would brush it off as nothing. When I finally got up and walked into the kitchen, Bryce was already there, frying eggs and bacon. He greeted me with his usual grin, completely unfazed by anything unusual. "Morning, Drew. Sleep okay?" he asked, sliding a plate across the counter toward me. I hesitated. "Yeah, I guess. I woke up in the middle of the night, though. Thought I heard something." Bryce didn't look up from the stove. "Probably just the wind. It gets loud out here sometimes." I nodded, forcing a smile. Maybe he was right. Maybe it had been the wind, or my imagination playing tricks on me. As we ate breakfast, Bryce started talking about the day's plans. He wanted to show me around Ashton Hollow, take me to the local diner, and introduce me to a few people. "You'll love it," he said. "This town has a lot of character. Everyone here knows everyone. It's like one big family." I wasn't so sure about that, but I agreed to go. After all, I'd come here to reconnect with Bryce, and sitting around dwelling on last night wasn't going to help. The town itself was peculiar. On the surface, it looked like any other small town. There was a main street lined with mom-and-pop shops, a post office, and a tiny park with a gazebo in the center. But something about the place felt off. The streets were too clean, the buildings too uniform, as if they'd been plucked from a postcard and dropped into the middle of nowhere. And the people, well, they were friendly enough, but there was something unsettling about their smiles. They all seemed a little too perfect, a little too practiced, like actors in a play. Bryce didn't seem to notice. He waved to nearly everyone we passed, calling them by name and exchanging pleasantries. "Hey, Mrs. Turner. How's the garden coming along?" "Morning, Tom. Catch any fish this week?" It was like he'd lived here his entire life, not just the past few years. At the diner, we sat in a booth by the window. Bryce ordered coffee and pie, insisting it was the best in the state. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, chatted with Bryce like they were old friends. "And who's this?" she asked, gesturing toward me. "This is Drew," Bryce said. "Old friend from high school. He's just visiting for the weekend." "Well, welcome to Ashton Hollow, Drew," she said with a warm smile. "Don't let Bryce keep you up too late. He's always been a night owl." Her words seemed innocent enough, but something about the way she said them sent a shiver down my spine. After lunch, Bryce took me on a hike through the woods that surrounded the town. He called it showing me the real Ashton Hollow. The trees were tall and ancient, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of moss and earth. "This is where I come to clear my head," Bryce said, stepping over a fallen log. "It's quiet, peaceful, like the town, but even better." As we walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me flinch. I tried to focus on Bryce's voice, but my mind kept drifting back to the figures I'd seen the night before. At one point, I stopped and turned around, scanning the trees. "What's up?" Bryce asked, noticing my hesitation. "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just thought I heard something," he grinned. "Probably a deer. There's tons of wildlife out here." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. By the time we got back to Bryce's house, the sun was starting to set. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. Bryce, on the other hand, seemed energized. "See? Isn't this place great?" he asked, dropping onto the couch with a satisfied sigh. "Yeah," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Bryce didn't seem to notice. He turned on the TV, flipping through channels until he found an old sports game. As the evening wore on, I found myself relaxing a little. Bryce's easygoing nature was infectious, and for a while, I almost forgot about the strange events of the night before. But then, just as the clock struck 9 zao, I heard it again, that low, droning hum. It wasn't coming from outside this time. It was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath the house. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Bryce didn't seem to notice the sound at all. He just kept watching TV, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Bryce," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. "Bryce," I said louder, my voice shaking. This time he turned to look at me, but his expression was wrong. His usually warm eyes were dull, almost lifeless, and his smile didn't reach them. "What's wrong, Drew?" he asked, his voice flat. I stared at him, my mind racing. What was happening here? The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Bryce blinked, his expression returning to normal. "You okay, man?" he asked, sounding genuinely concerned. I didn't know what to say. This marked the beginning of something I couldn't explain, a darkness lurking beneath the surface of Ashton Hollow. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint gust of wind outside sent my imagination spiraling. Bryce's strange reaction to the hum haunted me. It wasn't just the sound, it was the way he'd seemed detached from himself, almost like a puppet on strings. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the figures I'd seen in the yard. In the dream, they weren't just standing. They were moving, their silhouettes shifting and merging into one dark, writhing mass. The low hum accompanied their movements, vibrating through the air like a warning I couldn't ignore. I woke up in a cold sweat just before dawn, the memory of the dream, lingering like a shadow in the corners of my mind. The smell of coffee pulled me from bed. I threw on a sweatshirt and headed to the kitchen, where Bryce was once again cooking breakfast like nothing had happened. "Morning, Drew," he said with a grin, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the table. I nodded, sitting down across from him. "Morning." We ate in relative silence, the clinking of silverware on plates the only sound. I wanted to ask him about the hum, about what had happened last night, but I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding crazy. Finally, I decided to test the waters. "So, does this place always get that quiet at night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Bryce looked up, his fork paused mid-air. "What do you mean?" "Last night I thought I heard something. Like a humming sound. It was probably nothing, but it was weird." "You didn't hear it?" For a moment, Bryce just stared at me. Then he shook his head, laughing softly. "Nah, I didn't hear anything. You're probably just not used to how quiet it gets out here. City life can mess with your senses." His answer was dismissive, but there was something in his tone, something too quick, too rehearsed, that made me uneasy. I dropped the subject and focused on finishing my pancakes. After breakfast, Bryce suggested we take another walk through town. He wanted to show me the library, an old building near the edge of the square that doubled as a historical archive. "You like history, right?" he asked, his grin infectious. "Sure," I said, though I wasn't sure I wanted to spend more time exploring Ashton Hollow. The library was a small, unassuming building with faded brick walls and ivy climbing up its sides. Inside, it smelled of old paper and varnished wood. Bryce led me to a section near the back where rows of dusty books chronicled the town's history. "This is where I found out about all the weird old stuff in Ashton Hollow," he said, pulling. A book off the shelf. The founders, the legends, all that. He handed me the book, an oversized leather-bound tome titled The Forgotten Hollow, A History of Ashton. I flipped through the pages, skimming passages about early settlers and local folklore. One section caught my eye, The Callers of the Hollow. I stopped and read the passage aloud. They say that in the early 1900s, townsfolk began reporting strange noises late at night, low, droning hums that seemed to come from the woods. Those who followed the sounds often disappeared, their bodies never found. The few who returned spoke of figures in the dark and an irresistible compulsion to answer the call. I looked up at Bryce, my stomach twisting. This is just a story. Right? He shrugged. Probably, every town has its ghost stories, but the way he avoided my eyes told me he wasn't so sure. On our way out of the library, an older man sitting at a nearby table caught my eye. He was watching us intently, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "New in town?" he asked as we passed. I hesitated, unsure if I should answer, but Bryce stepped in. "He's just visiting," he said quickly. "Old friend of mine." The man nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me. "Be careful out here," he said. "Not everything in Ashton Hollow is as it seems." Bryce chuckled nervously and pulled me toward the door. "Don't mind him," he said once we were outside. "That's just old Charlie. He loves messing with outsiders." But something about Charlie's tone stuck with me. He hadn't sounded like he was joking. That evening we stayed in. Bryce cooked dinner again, grilled chicken with roasted vegetables, and we settled in front of the TV to watch a movie. By the time the credits rolled, I was beginning to feel like maybe I'd overreacted. The day had been uneventful, and Bryce's easygoing nature was starting to put me at ease. But just as I started to relax, I heard it. The hum. It was fainter this time, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A low, resonant vibration that seemed to seep into my bones. I turned to Bryce, expecting him to react, but he just stared at the TV, his face blank. "Bryce?" I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. "Bryce," I said louder, shaking his shoulder. He blinked, his head snapping toward me. For a moment his expression was vacant, his eyes unfocused. Then, as if nothing had happened, he smiled. "What's up?" he asked, his tone casual. I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "The hum. It's—" I stopped, realizing how crazy I sounded. "Never mind." Bryce shrugged and turned back to the TV. I couldn't sleep. That night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the hum, and every time I opened them, I felt like someone or something was watching me. By this point, I knew something was wrong in Ashton Hollow. But I had no idea just how deep the mystery went, or how much danger I was in. The next morning, I woke to the sound of something faint but rhythmic. Muffled footsteps outside. It wasn't until I opened my eyes that I realized they weren't random. They were in unison, deliberate, like a synchronized march. Throwing on a jacket, I moved to the window and peeked through the curtains. My breath caught in my throat. The townsfolk were outside their homes, lined up along the sidewalks. Their postures were unnervingly rigid, their faces blank, as they walked toward the center of town. The same low hum from the night before seemed to emanate from the air itself, growing louder as the procession continued. I glanced at Bryce's bed across the hall, empty. My pulse quickened as I moved to the door, opening it just enough to see the line of people stretching down the street. Every single resident, young and old, was walking with the same mechanical precision. I hesitated, debating whether to follow them. Curiosity won over fear, and I slipped outside, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. I followed the procession into the town square. The gazebo, which had seemed charming and quaint, during the day, now cast long, sinister shadows in the dim morning light. The people gathered in a tight circle around it, their movements eerily synchronized as they turned to face inward. At first, they just stood there, motionless, their gazes fixed on the empty gazebo. Then, as if on cue, they began to hum, a low, droning sound that matched the one reverberating through the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Bryce was among them. He stood at the edge of the circle, his normally vibrant face devoid of expression. I crept closer, keeping to the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. It wasn't human. Suddenly the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then, in unison, the crowd raised their arms toward the sky. I froze, my mind racing. What was I witnessing? Some kind of cult? A mass hallucination? The sky above. The gazebo seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from asphalt. For a brief moment I thought I saw something, an outline, a shape. But before I could focus, the townsfolk lowered their arms and began to disperse, walking back to their homes as if nothing had happened. I hurried back to Bryce's house, slipping inside just before he returned. I tried to compose myself, but my hands were still shaking when I heard the front door open and close. "Morning," Bryce called out, his tone light and casual. I stepped into the living room, trying to act normal. "Morning." Bryce smiled at me as he poured a cup of coffee. "Sleep well?" I stared at him, my frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. "Bryce, what the hell is going on in this town?" He frowned, setting his mug down. "What do you mean?" "I mean the people standing outside their houses, the humming, the ritual in the square. Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about." Bryce's expression shifted, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something colder. "Drew, I think you've been working too hard. Maybe all that travel is getting to you." "Don't gaslight me," I snapped. "I saw you out there this morning, Bryce. You were standing in that circle with the rest of them. Don't tell me it didn't happen." For a moment he just stared at me, his face unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, man," he said, his tone softer. "I don't know what you think you saw, but I promise. There's nothing weird about Ashton Hollow. It's just a quiet town. That's it." But his words rang hollow. His eyes, usually so full of life, seemed distant, as if part of him wasn't really there. Later that day, I decided to leave the house and clear my head. Bryce had gone to run errands, and I needed space to process everything. As I walked through the town, I felt the weight of eyes on me. People I passed smiled and waved, but their friendliness felt forced, almost robotic. I ended up back at the library, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. To my surprise, the old man from the day before, Charlie, was there again, sitting at the same table. He looked up as I approached, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Still here?" he asked, his voice gruff. I sat down across from him, lowering my voice. "What's going on in this town? I know you know something." Charlie chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You've seen them, haven't you? The callers." I nodded. "They've been here as long as anyone can remember," he said, leaning in. "No one knows where they came from or what they want, but they're part of Ashton Hollow now, always have been." "Why doesn't anyone leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Charlie's expression darkened. "You can leave, but you'll never forget. And if you stay too long, you become part of it. Like your friend." His words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" Charlie hesitated, glancing around as if he were afraid someone might overhear. "The longer you're here, the more they get inside your head. You won't even realize it's happening, until it's too late. That's how they keep the town under control." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "How do I stop it?" Charlie shook his head. "You can't. All you can do is leave before they take you too." When I returned to Bryce's house, I found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the woods. He didn't turn to look at me as I approached. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, but his movements were slow, almost mechanical. "Yeah, just thinking." I didn't press him. Instead, I went inside, my unease growing with every passing second. That night, the hum returned. It was louder this time, vibrating through the walls like a living thing. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it did little to block the sound. And then I heard it. the front door creaking open. I crept to the window, my heart pounding. Outside, I saw Bryce walking down the street, joining the other townsfolk as they made their way toward the square. This time, I couldn't just watch. I had to follow. I hesitated at the door, my hand resting on the doorknob as I debated whether to follow Bryce. The hum vibrated through the walls, growing louder with every second. My instincts screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the door, and wait until morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't go, I'd never understand what was happening in Ashton Hollow, or what was happening to Bryce. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The cool night air prickled my skin, but it wasn't the cold that sent shivers down my spine. It was the silence. Apart from the hum, the town was deathly quiet, as if the world had paused to watch what was about to unfold. The townsfolk were ahead of me, their movements slow and deliberate as they marched toward the square. I stayed in the shadows, keeping my distance but close enough to see Bryce among them. His usual confident stride was gone, replaced by the same mechanical rhythm as the others. As we neared the square, I noticed something strange. The air seemed heavier, almost oppressive, and the hum grew so loud it felt like it was coming from inside my head. My vision blurred at the edges, and for a moment, I felt a pull, a compulsion to step out of the shadows and join them. I gritted my teeth and shook my head, fighting the urge. Whatever was happening here, I couldn't let it take hold of me. When we reached the square, the townsfolk formed their usual circle around the gazebo. But this time, something was different. In the center of the gazebo stood a figure. It was cloaked in shadow, its form barely visible beneath a tattered robe that seemed to ripple like smoke. Its presence was wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. The hum ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it made my ears ring. The figure raised a hand, or what I assumed was a hand, and the townsfolk dropped to their knees, in unison. I pressed myself against a nearby building, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever this thing was, it had control over the entire town. The figure began to speak, its voice a low, guttural rumble that I couldn't understand. The townsfolk, however, seemed to respond, murmuring in a language I'd never heard before. It was as if they were answering its call, bound to it in some way I couldn't comprehend. Bryce was among them, kneeling with his head bowed. His lips moved in time with the others, speaking the same strange words. I watched in horror as the figure raised its hand again, and the air around the gazebo began to ripple, just like before. This time, though, the effect was more pronounced. The ground seemed to shift, and the stars above flickered as if the entire town was caught between two realities. It hit me then. This wasn't just some bizarre ritual. It was a summoning. Whatever was happening in Ashton Hollow, it wasn't confined to this town. It was something bigger, something older, and the townsfolk were part of it. My mind raced. If I didn't stop this, or at least get out of here, I might never escape. Just as I was about to turn and run, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around, ready to fight, but it was Charlie, the old man from the library. "Quiet," he hissed, pulling me back into the shadows. "What are you doing here?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Saving your life," he said. "You shouldn't have followed them." "I couldn't just stay behind," I said, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my chest. "What is that thing?" Charlie's expression darkened. "Something that shouldn't exist. It's been here longer than the town itself, feeding off the people, keeping them under its control. The callers, they're its servants." I stared at him, my stomach twisting. "How do we stop it?" Charlie shook his head. "You can't. The only thing you can do is leave and never look back." "But Bryce, he's already gone," Charlie said, cutting me off. "Once they start answering the call, there's no saving them." I refused to believe that. Bryce wasn't just some random stranger. He was my best friend. If there was even a chance to save him, I had to try. Ignoring Charlie's warnings, I stepped closer to the square, keeping to the shadows. The figure in the gazebo seemed to pulse with energy, its form shifting and flickering like a flame. I scanned the circle, searching for Bryce. When I found him, I took a deep breath and darted forward, grabbing his arm and yanking him to his feet. "Bryce, it's me," I whispered urgently. "We have to go." For a moment his eyes met mine, and I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. But then his expression hardened and he tried to pull away. "Leave me," he said, his voice cold and distant. "No." I tightened my grip. "This isn't you. Bryce, fight it." The figure in the gazebo turned toward us, its empty gaze piercing through the darkness. The hum returned, louder and more oppressive than ever, forcing me to my knees. Bryce tore free from my grasp and rejoined the circle, his movements robotic. I tried to stand, but the weight of the sound pinned me to the ground. My vision blurred and I felt that same compulsion, that same pull, urging me to join them. Just as I was about to give in, Charlie appeared beside me, hauling me to my feet. "Come on," he shouted over the hum, dragging me away from the square. I stumbled after him, my legs weak and my mind clouded. Behind us, the townsfolk began to chant again, their voices rising in a cacophony that made my ears bleed. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town. "Go," Charlie said, shoving me toward my car. "Get out of here while you still can." "What about you?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "I've been here too long," he said, his expression grim. "It's too late for me, but you still have a chance." I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told me he wouldn't budge. Without another word, I got in my car and drove. As I sped down the dark, winding road, I couldn't shake the image of Bryce's face, the emptiness in his eyes, the way he'd spoken to me like I was a stranger. Whatever had taken him, it wasn't going to stop with Ashton Hollow. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. I drove until the town of Ashton Hollow disappeared in my rearview mirror, its looming presence replaced by endless miles of shadowy woods. The hum lingered in my ears, a phantom vibration that refused to fade, even as the car ate up the distance. The road twisted and turned, my headlights slicing through the dark. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Bryce, or worse, the figure from the gazebo, following me. But the road remained empty, save for the occasional flash of nocturnal eyes from the forest's edge. I should have felt relief at putting miles between myself and that cursed town, but unease clung to me like a second skin. My thoughts churned, replaying the events of the past few days. The hum, the ritual, Bryce's blank stare, all of it pointed to something I couldn't explain, something that defied logic. And yet, I couldn't shake the guilt. I'd left Bryce behind. After hours of driving, exhaustion began to take its toll. My eyes burned, and my hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had to pull over, if only for a few minutes, to gather my thoughts and steady my nerves. I spotted a lone gas station on the horizon, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. Pulling into the station, I parked near the pumps and stepped out into the cold night air. The place was deserted, the store's interior dimly lit and cluttered with shelves of dusty snacks and faded advertisements. I hesitated before walking in, the bell above the door jingling sharply in the silence. Behind the counter stood an older man with thick glasses and a tired expression. He barely glanced at me as I approached, his focus fixed on a small TV playing. Static in the corner. "Just passing through?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't sure where I was headed. "Can I get a coffee?" He nodded and shuffled to a stained coffee pot on the far counter. As I waited, I noticed a corkboard near the entrance, plastered with faded flyers. Most were mundane, ads for missing pets, yard sales, and community events. But one caught my eye. It was a grainy black and white photo of a man about my age, with a caption that read, "Missing Bryce Crawford, last seen in Ashton Hollow." My heart sank. I ripped the flyer from the board and stared at it, my hands trembling. The photo was unmistakably Bryce, but the details were wrong. It claimed he'd gone missing 5 years ago, long before he'd ever invited me to visit. "That's an old one," the man behind the counter said, startling me. "Came through here once, looking for him. Never found anything, though." "Who came through?" I asked, my voice tight. "Family, I think, maybe a friend. Don't get many visitors from Ashton Hollow, though." He handed me my coffee and I set the flyer on the counter. "Doesn't make sense," I muttered. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't press. I left the gas station feeling more confused than ever. How could Bryce have been missing for years if I'd just spent the weekend with him? Was the person I'd been with even Bryce at all? Back on the road, I kept glancing at the flyer on the passenger seat, its presence an unwelcome reminder of the growing mystery. My exhaustion was giving way to something worse, a gnawing paranoia that I couldn't shake. The hum returned. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but as the sound grew louder, I realized it wasn't coming from inside my head. It was coming from the car. I pulled over again, my pulse racing as I killed the engine and stepped out. The hum persisted, faint but undeniable, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. And then I saw them. Figures stood in the distance, barely visible through the mist that clung to the road. They weren't moving, just standing there, their forms blending into the shadows of the trees. My breath caught as I realized they were lined up on both sides of the road, stretching into the darkness ahead. I climbed back into the car and locked the doors, my heart hammering against my ribs. The figures didn't move, but their presence was enough to send my thoughts spiraling. What did they want? Why were they following me? With no other options, I started the engine and drove forward, inching past the shadowy silhouettes. As I passed, I couldn't help but glance at them. Their faces were obscured, but I could feel their eyes on me, unblinking and cold. The hum grew louder as I left them behind, a droning symphony that filled the car. I turned the radio on, desperate to drown it out, but all I got was static. The time I reached a small motel on the outskirts of the next town, I was barely holding it together. My hands shook as I checked in, mumbling something about needing a room for the night. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, handed me a key without question. Once inside, I locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, my thoughts racing. I couldn't make sense of any of it. The ritual, the flyer, the figures on the road. It felt like the rules of reality were slipping through my fingers. I grabbed my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years, Bryce's parents. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Hello? Mrs. Crawford, it's Drew," I said, my voice shaking. There was a long pause. "Drew, I haven't heard from you in, well, years. Is everything okay?" I don't know," I admitted. "I saw Bryce. He invited me to Ashton Hollow, but—" "Bryce?" she interrupted, her voice trembling. You saw Bryce?" "Yes," I said, confused by her reaction. "He's living there. At least, I thought he was." Another long silence. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Drew, Bryce has been missing for 5 years. We thought he was dead." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "No," I said, shaking my head. "That's impossible." I talked. To him, I stayed at his house. "Drew," she said, her tone firm but desperate. "Whatever you saw, whoever you spoke to, that wasn't Bryce." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hands trembling. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was something I didn't want to see. Bryce was gone. The person I'd spent the weekend with was something else, something tied to Ashton Hollow and the ritual I'd witnessed. Whatever was controlling the town, it had taken Bryce, just like it had taken the others. And now, it was following me. The hum hadn't stopped. It was louder now, vibrating through the walls of the motel like a living thing. As I sat there, trying to decide my next move, I realized one thing with chilling certainty. I wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. The hum grew louder. It pulsed through the walls of the motel room, making the floor vibrate beneath my feet. My hands gripped the edge of the bed, my pulse racing as I realized there was no escape from it. I checked my phone for the time. 3:17 a.m. The room was bathed in dim, flickering light from the neon motel sign outside, casting shifting shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. I couldn't stay here, not with the hum closing in. Grabbing my bag, I stuffed it with whatever I could reach: my wallet, my phone charger, and the flyer from the gas station. The sight of Bryce's face sent a pang of guilt through me, but I couldn't focus on that now. I needed to move. I threw the door open, stepping into the frigid night air. The parking lot was empty, but the hum was deafening now, emanating from somewhere just out of sight. And then I saw them. The figures were back, their silhouettes lining the edge of the woods behind the motel. There were dozens of them, maybe more, standing perfectly still, their faces hidden in shadow. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. They didn't move, but their presence was overwhelming, a weight pressing down on me. I turned and sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys, as my hands shook. When the engine finally roared to life, I slammed the door shut and threw the car into reverse, speeding out of the lot. The figures didn't follow, but their image burned into my mind, etched there like a brand. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, the empty highway stretching endlessly before me. The hum ebbed and flowed, sometimes faint, sometimes so loud it drowned out the sound of the engine. As dawn broke, I found myself on a narrow, winding road surrounded by dense woods. The trees towered over me, their branches interlocking to form a canopy that blocked out the light. The flyer sat on the passenger seat, its edges crumpled from my grip. Bryce's face stared back at me, his expression frozen in time. Charlie's warning echoed in my mind. Once they start answering the call, there's no saving them. I knew I should turn back, leave Ashton Hollow and everything tied to it behind. But something deeper pulled at me, a stubborn need to understand, to confront whatever had taken Bryce. I wasn't just running from the call anymore, I was running toward it. By midday, I was back on the gravel road that led into Ashton Hollow. The town looked the same as it had when I first arrived, its streets quiet and its houses perfectly neat. But now, the stillness felt oppressive, like the town itself was watching me. I parked outside Bryce's house, staring at the familiar front porch. It was exactly as I'd left it, down to the muddy footprints I'd tracked up the steps. The door creaked open as I pushed inside, and I was greeted by the same faint smell of wood smoke and old furniture. "Bryce?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty house. No response. I made my way to the living room where the remnants of our last night together still sat. 2 empty beer bottles on the coffee table, an old sports game paused on the TV. For a moment, I felt a pang of loss so sharp it nearly brought me to my knees. But then the hum returned. It started softly, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the floorboards. I followed it, moving deeper into the house until I reached the basement door. The air grew colder as I descended, each step echoing in the silence. At the bottom of the stairs, I found an old wooden door, its surface worn and splintered. The hum was deafening now, pulsing behind it like a living thing. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit, its walls covered in strange symbols carved into the stone. At the center of the room stood a figure cloaked. In shadow, its form shifting and flickering like a mirage. Bryce was there too, kneeling before it. "Bryce!" I shouted, my voice cracking. He turned slowly, his eyes black and empty. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. I stepped closer, my hands trembling. "Bryce, it's me, it's Drew. Come on, we can leave. We can get out of here." He shook his head. "There's no leaving. Not for me. Not for any of us." The figure shifted, its presence pressing against me like a physical force. It spoke, its voice low and guttural, echoing in a language I couldn't understand. Bryce stood, turning to face me fully. "It wants you," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "It's been calling you since you arrived." I shook my head, backing away. "No, I'm not like the others. I don't belong here." "You do now," Bryce said. "You answered the call." The hum grew louder, wrapping around me like a vice. My vision blurred, and I felt that same compulsion I'd felt before, the pull to join them, to kneel, to give in. But then I saw it, a small flickering light in the corner of the room. I moved toward it instinctively, ignoring Bryce's warnings and the figure's oppressive presence. The light led me to an old rusted lever embedded in the wall. Without thinking, I pulled it. The room shuddered violently, the hum breaking into a cacophony of discordant tones. The figure let out a piercing shriek as the light grew brighter, filling the space with blinding intensity. When the light faded, the room was empty. The figure, Bryce, the symbols, everything was gone. I stumbled out of the basement and into the sunlight, my chest heaving with each breath. I left Ashton Hollow. That day, driving until the town was nothing but a distant memory, but the memory doesn't stay buried for long. Even now, weeks later, I can still hear the hum in quiet moments, vibrating at the edge of my mind. Sometimes I dream of the town, of Bryce, of the figure in the shadows. I don't know what happened to Ashton Hollow after I left. Maybe it's still there, waiting for its next visitor. But one thing is certain: the call never truly stops.